Does an act have to be decidedly or consciously decolonial in order to perform decolonial work? The answer to the question is within it. Performance. Performance is about embodiment, and embodiment constructs lived reality through routinized action. Spatial and social worlds are created through the enactment of identities, politics, and positionings within assemblages of power, with each lending significance to the other. This means that social factors contribute to spatial factors, while the features of a space in turn influences social relations taking place within that space. According to Don McCormack, embodiment is also a path to power. Bodily praxis can be used to challenge the routines, norms, and assumptions, including challenging post-colonial assemblages of power, referred to as decolonial praxis. This essay is part of a larger work that explores how same-sex loving women in Trinidad embody their identities in ways that challenge the coloniality within the society, focusing on their emphasis on self-determination, their space-making and mapping practices, and their use of eroticism and spirituality to disrupt colonial ideals of time, space, and self. In this essay, I focus on the Indo-Trinidadian female body, the erotic practices of same-sex loving women of Indian descent, and how they challenge the coloniality within Trinidadian society. I refer to the Indo-Caribbean or Indo-Trinidadian female body as post-colonial, as the social interpretations of these bodies were shaped by and through colonial discourses of race and gender. In Trinidad and Tobago, what are the markers that designate the body as Indo-Trinidadian woman? And what are the expectations that are placed on these bodies? I argue that the contemporary meaning is based on the colonial past, which includes indenture and post-indenture constructions of East Indian femininity, East Indian being the term that was used and still sometimes is in the West Indies to distinguish indentured Indians from Amerindian, the colonial term used for indigenous people, and also West Indies as a colonial term. Initially seen as prostitutes and women of loose morals, discourses of nation and religion were mobilized to sanitize the image of East Indian femininity, to construct the Indian woman as pure, especially contrasted to women of African descent. The re-establishment of Indian cultural practices was centrally utilized to shape the image of the respectable Indian woman by deifying femininity through the female goddess, yet mobilizing the damsel in distress narrative of women as vulnerable and in need of protection. This cultural and religious retention and revival in the diaspora was also a mechanism for coping with the trauma of indentureship and for remembering home. Embodiment is memory, and the body is living memory, or as Gopinath puts it, a historical narrative for both individuals and communities. Embodiment is a way of remembering a past time and space. It was a way of constituting themselves as a people. After their months-long boat journey, migrants set out to reinvent familiarity and to reconstitute their own Indias in the Caribbean. The remembering of self in the diaspora through embodiment of retained and retrieved cultural practices is an attempt to heal these wounds that indentureship and post-indenture socioeconomic marginalization have left on Indo-Caribbean bodies. Often conflated with Hindu, Indian in this context tends to be associated with heteropatriarchal conservative ideals that are and were produced in Hindu nationalism in India and the Brahminical Puranic ritual practices of Sanatana Dharma. These same nationalist and religious discourses were then used to police Indian women's behaviors to ensure the continued embodiment of this image through their performance. Gopinath notes that queer diasporic cultural forms work against the violent effacements that produce the fictions of purity that lie at the heart of dominant nationalist and diasporic ideologies, meaning that cultural forms produced by and from a queer diasporic perspective can disrupt the fictional assertions of purity as made by nation and diaspora. I add that not only cultural forms, but everyday praxis of queer subjects can contest these fictions and expose the heterogeneity and contradictions within the diaspora. Decolonizing the Indo-Trinidadian female body means challenging these post-colonial ascriptions that both necessitate and reinforce colonial heteropatriarchal memory and embodiment. In the post-colonial body in queer time and space, Rebecca Fine-Romanow aligns the post-colonial with queer non-normative space and temporality, constructed by the history of colonization, the process of othering, and the pressures and realities of the diaspora and the emerging global communities. These processes disrupt normative time and space, whilst creating a narrative that tries to gloss over the disruptions and portray these sites as normal. But the post-colonial subject performatively embodies these disruptions, and in so doing, queer the assumed norms. Working from this assumption, one can interrogate the local and everyday survival strategies and acts of resistance engaged in by queers within the diaspora. My book project engages with interviews I conducted with 40 women who experienced same-sex desire. 13 of these women were of solely Indian descent, 8 were of mixed Indian and African descent, referred to in Trinidad as Dogla, and 1 woman was of Indian and Chinese descent. In this paper, when I say Indo-Caribbean or Indo-Trinidadian, I leave that designation open to include these women of mixed race, as I consider their subjectivities formed as a result of their shared Indian background and the shared history of oppression within the heteropatriarchal settler colonial system experienced by these other racial groups. Of the 22 women with some amount of Indian descent, 7 participated in a mapping exercise where they drew representations of their safe spaces. For those who did not draw maps, I look at their narratives as representations of the cognitive maps that they have produced through conscious and subconscious thought based on their experiences of space. Using insights from these interviews and maps, this paper explores multiple dimensions of Indo-Trinidadian same-sex loving women's decolonial queer praxis, their everyday practices of resistance and negotiation that enact a decolonial politic. Throughout this paper, I explore the themes of memory, corporeality, temporality in relation to the following 3 decolonial acts. Firstly, the bodily praxis of same-sex loving Indo-Trinidadian women rejects singular monolithic identities defined on their behalf by those who had power over them within the colonial heteropatriarchal system, and instead demonstrates their attempt at self-determination. Aditi was in her early 30s when she was interviewed, and she shared the following. We lived as sisters for years until we didn't care about people anymore, not even family. It was the best years of my life, though tough to be called lesbian, pussy sucker, stink, trying to go against God's natural order. She became my family and my life, and we battled everything together. In the business world, we made it because of our business minds put together. Family, in fact, disowned us and never gave us support in any way, but we managed because we believed we were soulmates and we would be together in any and every form in life. Well, I'm no longer involved in all the over-religious shit, as you're aware of. I had my share of real testing times. My private life blew out of proportion, and well, the siblings I have no longer talk to me. I have an estranged relationship with my father who thinks I disgraced the family. The only person who knew and loved me for it was Ma. So it goes like that. Here, she uses it to refer to her same-sex desire and dating women. She said that after her mother's death, her relationship with the rest of the family deteriorated. In this passage, Aditi recollects what it was like to be in a relationship with a woman and the troubling process of self-making while in that relationship and in relation to her family and contact with the wider community. She remembers the relationship with her partner as the best years of my life, yet she simultaneously dealt with estrangement from her family. Exploring subjectivities through memory can be likened to recovering versions of the self in specific contexts. In the above quote, she mentions multiple versions of herself, as a girlfriend, as a sister, a daughter to her mother and to her father, as a member or former member of a religious community, and as each of the many names that she said she had been called. She had been each of these selves either from her own or another's perspective, due to the performances and positioning of her body. There have been expectations of how she should ideally embody each of these roles, and her inability or resistance to do so resulted in her estrangement from others with whom she held that relationship. The performance of particular acts in different contexts emphasizes the nuances of embodiment, memory, subjectivity, and space. Considering Aditi's same-sex desire is enough to reveal the varied experiences of each of her identities or positionalities and the tensions therein. The erotic thus offers a glimpse into various aspects of Aditi's social, political, and cultural life by demonstrating the meaning that her same-sex desire takes on in these different contexts. Tension is produced when her same-sex desire does not fit with the ideals expected of that identity as prescribed by those who have defined it. It is here that we begin to see the limitations and flaws in the collective memory of the diaspora. Diasporic memory is selective. They remember the ideal image of self that they would like to project and reproduce, but it is not necessarily a true and whole memory of the past. Here I'm referring to the erasure of same-sex desire as something Indian or part of a well-documented history and a mythology associated with Indian and Hindu as with the work of Ruth Finita. Who does this memory serve? For whom is it beneficial to remember and to forget these narratives and these different versions of self? Secondly, I address mapping as decolonial through its disruptions of time and space. Mapping, or map-making, or drawing maps, can be a form of decolonial praxis as it challenges the coloniality of space, including the conceptions of space, the linearity of space and time, the meanings of material space, the fixity or movement of ideologies through spaces, and individual and collective relationships to space. Here I discuss two features of subjective maps. First, their disruption of the linearity of time and space through their layering of meaning and drawing from multiple points in time and space. And secondly, the depiction of different iterations of power at work in those contexts, including same-sex loving women's challenges to coloniality and heteronormative power. I used the map drawn by Jaya, a bi-identified Hindu female from rural Trinidad in her mid-20s at the time of being interviewed. Although created at a fixed point in time, the maps depicted spaces within different temporal frames without removing the complicated social aspects therein. Jaya's map disrupts time by drawing on her multiple experiences and the experiences of others. Her unsafe space is the city. Her drawing depicts how I perceive most interactions in Trinidad. It shows skyscrapers with two female figures, one on the edge of the roof of one building and the other at ground level, appearing to pair up at the tower before her. The image represents the fundamental disconnect that people have in public space, especially when they feel like they have to hide something. So I can be either one. I have felt like both at different times, like I'm out on a ledge out in society, like too much of me is being seen, like I want to retreat. And I've also felt like I've seen people that way and how it is for them, and I've wanted to do something, reach out, help them, empathize, but I'm afraid to. It's not how society is predicated, so keep your distance. And it's not fair that people just pass each other with no knowledge of how unsafe or perilous that person's existence is. How much of their time is consumed with concealing huge parts of themselves, and I feel like most of my public interactions are like that. There are conversations that I could have with people that never get had because of how uncomfortable it is to engage with people about anything, particularly sexuality. Like a lot of public local space is not safe. It's not supportive, not welcoming, just there to fulfill functions and to support infrastructure and keep society running in a civilized, mechanic kind of way. Due to her dislike for the city, Jaya avoided events organized for and by the LGBT community, which often took place in the city, mainly in middle or upper class areas. Because of this, she also found the community to be pretentious and disingenuous, modeling a type of queer freedom they had seen in movies or TV about what queer life is like in global cities in the US or Europe. This does not mean that events were not held for working class communities or in working class areas, but that organized LGBT movements and associations that Jaya was in contact with tended to group more around middle and upper class activities and spaces, such as going to art galleries and various clubs and bars. Jaya still had community, however, all of the safe spaces she identified pertained to community, a community of peers, of writers and readers, of women who she felt were honest and authentic, and community that was not geographically fixed or singular. Represented by the image of three girls holding hands in a circle, Jaya describes a community of like-minded women who are vocal and liberal, who either themselves identify as non-normative or as allies. Consisting of members located locally and internationally, the group more often than not communes virtually to spend time together and engage in real time. Online then becomes an interesting forum for this bridging of time and space. It has allowed Jaya to participate in this community. She said, "I'm not very placard and knocking on doors, so I guess what I try to do, particularly on Facebook and I guess through Twitter, is subtle, and it tends to generate responses that are also not direct, private responses to things I share in public space with people who want to continue the conversation, but not through public space. I guess that's how it works, as opposed to being like a big public soapbox and have those big long fights with people on Facebook. Also blogging. I guess the main page here is a blog. I guess the reality is it's easy to be a big supporter of most things online than it is to support in public space, which I suppose can be equated to cowardice. But when protesting is concerned, it can have a lot to do with public safety, with whether or not you're going to get punched in the face in Woodford Square as opposed to making a blog post about it. A lot of that safety gets engendered through discussion online. Interestingly, Jaya distinguishes between different kinds of public space. Online is a different kind of public that occurs simultaneously and alongside the other kinds of public space that Jaya shuns and avoids. Online facilitates one to be and participate in multiple places at once, anywhere in the world, virtually eradicating the limitations of time and space for sociality, as well as for being politically active and engaging in political action like outreach, advocacy, and protesting. She can be public online while still being protected from the violence she fears in other offline public spaces. Of course, online is not free of violence, but that is for another discussion. Finally, I address what M. Jackie Alexander refers to as pedagogies of the spirit, the use of the body as medium to connect to the spiritual realm and attain understandings of self. This refers to different ways of knowing that are denied in colonial schemas of knowledge and epistemologies. According to Alexander, spiritual labor and spiritual knowing is primarily a project of self-knowing and transformation, whether done within or outside the bounds of mainstream religion. While an individual process, it requires community to make experiences intelligible through the communal translation of shared spiritual phenomena. Oftentimes, spirituality is aligned with tradition and thus considered backward and retrogressive for modern society. But scholars such as Alexander, Gloria Wecker, and Gloria Anzaldúa demonstrate the essential role spirituality plays in self-determination. Alexander posits that the sacred is an ever-changing yet permanent condition of the universe and not just an embarrassingly unfortunate byproduct of tradition in which women are disproportionately caught. She also recognizes its role in sustaining diasporic populations in the Caribbean, saying that many individuals would not have survived the crossing without it. Many have been persecuted because of it. Sandy, of mixed Indian and African descent, grew up in a Roman Catholic home. For her, religion was a central part of her self-concept. Her active engagement in religious schooling, her regular attendance and extracurricular activities pertaining to the church community, youth groups, and prayer circles all serve to strengthen her faith while producing a deep-seated internal conflict. I have a lecturer who counsels me. Apparently, I need counseling because I'm spiritually sick. This woman, she is a real devout Catholic, and I get the impression that she was a lesbian once because she knows too much. She understands it too well, and she told me that I have to understand that it is not real love, that nothing could come of it. It is a dead road, and I have to give it time. But what Sandy experiences emotionally and physically towards this individual poses a tremendous obstacle for her embracing this advice. But it's a real paradox, you know. How do you stay away from somebody who in your heart you feel you really love and could be with, you enjoy being with? You know, some people you could like but you never bond with. I'm united with this individual in that particular way. And yes, there is a lot of sex involved, but it's more than sex. If it was just about sex, I would have lost interest already, because I'm not a sexually driven person. But I have a strong needing to be with her all the time. And it's fuck up, real fuck up, because it is frustrating, very, very frustrating. She feels strongly about her sexuality as well as her spirituality, but feels as though she's restricted from being both same-sex loving and a Christian. She continued, "You can't be a Christian, period, and that refusal to let me be, it is so hypocritical. We say we love God and we all for God and thing, but we can't let people live their lives and figure out what God is for ourselves." This raises another challenge to coloniality. Western religious traditions are not necessarily more free than Eastern traditions. Vani, in her mid-30s at the time of her interview, grew up in a very Hindu household. She married her boyfriend from university, becoming a parent and a good Hindu wife. The relation did not last, however, and Vani returned to Hinduism to rationalize her own emergent same-sex desires. Mandirs across Trinidad and Tobago have paintings and murtis of Ardhanarishwar, the half-Shiv, half-Durga form. When interpreted as a balance of male and female energies, it is used to support reproductive heterosexuality. But Vani looked beyond the material form of the body to interpret this avatar as the harmonious union of these dual spirit entities within the individual. She used this symbolism to represent fluidity of gender performance, including sexual desire. As a spiritual practitioner, Vani employs the system of myths to provide the moorings for her understanding of self. She uses her memories of the sacred to shape her subjective understandings of self. In seeking to answer the question of her same-sex desires, where it comes from, what's its purpose, is it right or wrong, Vani and others like her use spiritual knowledge to justify their embodiment. Vani's experience with Hinduism contrasts Sandy's with Catholicism, contradicting the belief that of coloniality modernity, that Eastern religions are more closed-minded and restrictive, especially for women, than Western Christianity. They also contradict the belief that queer sexuality cannot or does not coexist alongside religion. By subscribing to religious views while actively pursuing their same-sex desires, these queer women in the diaspora occupy a space that simultaneously parallels and transcends that of modernity. Their embodiment of their sexual desires resists the teleological narrative of coloniality modernity that sees confinement in tradition and the past and liberation in secularism and the future. The women discussed in this paper use their bodies to resist all they are told they must be and instead embody an alternative. Decolonial praxis is work aimed at remembering different and silenced stories of the past, uncovering lived realities in the present, and creating possibilities for a different future. Through their sexual praxis, their BAPs, their religiosity, and their working to build a life where they can be free, same-sex loving women of Indian descent embody their resistances to coloniality.